thinking about selling a home in Alamo Heights, one of the first questions that usually comes up is whether you should renovate before putting it on the market. And on the surface, that seems like a straightforward decision. Improve the home, increase the value, and sell for more. But what most sellers quickly realize is that it's not nearly that simple, because not all renovations create value in the way people expect. Not all updates are viewed the same way by buyers. And in many cases, doing the wrong work or even doing the right work at the wrong level can actually reduce return instead of improving it. And that makes this especially true in Alamo Heights, is that homes here vary significantly in age, condition, and style. So buyers are not walking in with a single expectation. They're actually evaluating each home in context and comparing it to what they've seen and deciding whether the condition aligns with the price. And that's where renovation decisions become less about improvement and more about positioning, because the goal is not to create the most updated home. The goal is to create a home that makes sense to the buyer at the price point it will be positioned. So what I want to do is walk you through 7 things you should understand before deciding whether or not to renovate. The first thing you need to understand is that not all renovations create equal return, because this is where many sellers get tripped up. It's easy to assume that an improvement adds value, but buyers don't assign value based on how much you spent. They actually assign value based on how the home compares to the other options that are on the market. So you can spend a significant amount updating something that buyers already consider acceptable, and that investment may not translate into a higher sales price. On the flip side, there are situations where smaller, more targeted updates can completely change how the home is perceived. And that shift in perception is what drives stronger offers. So instead of asking, what can I improve? The better question is, what actually will change how the buyer interprets this home? Because that's where the return is created. And the second thing you need to understand is that buyers in Alamo Heights do not all want the same level of finish. And this is a critical nuance in this market, because some buyers are specifically looking for homes that are fully updated and move-in ready, while others are intentionally looking for homes that they can update over time. And that means there's not a single correct level of renovation. There are multiple buyer profiles, and the goal is to decide which one you are and position your home accordingly. Because if you are trying to meet every expectation, you often will end up in the middle, where the home is partially updated, partially not clearly aligned with specific buyer groups, and that lack of clarity creates hesitation. And hesitation, well, it slows decisions. And in a market where buyers are comparing homes carefully, clarity is what creates momentum. And the third thing you need to understand is that over-renovating is one of the most common and most expensive mistakes sellers can make. And this usually comes from good intentions, really. Wanting the home to show well, wanting to maximize value, wanting to compete with the best properties on the market. But the challenge is that there is a ceiling to what buyers are willing to pay based on location, layout, and overall market context. And once you exceed that ceiling with upgrades, you don't necessarily increase your return. You simply reduce your margin. And what we often see is sellers investing heavily in finishes that do not significantly change how the home is positioned relative to other options. And while the home may look updated, it doesn't always translate into a proportional increase in price. And that's where renovation decisions need to be approached strategically, not how do I make this perfect, but more like what level of improvement actually changes the outcome. Because this is where the difference is made between spending money and creating value. And once you understand that not all renovations create equal return, and that buyers in Alamo Heights are not all looking for the same level of finish, and that over-renovating can actually reduce your margin instead of improving it, the fourth thing you need to understand before deciding whether to renovate is that buyers notice condition before they notice finishes. This is really important. It's a good distinction, because a lot of sellers focus on cosmetic updates, new countertops, updated fixtures, fresh design elements, while overlooking the foundational aspects of the home. And what buyers are actually evaluating first is whether the home feels well maintained, whether the systems appear to be in good condition, whether there are visible signs of deferred maintenance, and whether the home feels solid and cared for overall. Because if those foundational elements create uncertainty, no amount of cosmetic improvements fully offsets that hesitation. And this is where renovation decisions need to be prioritized correctly, because addressing maintenance issues, roof, HVAC, plumbing, electrical, and foundation concerns often has a greater impact on buyer confidence than upgrading finishes that were already acceptable. And when buyers feel confident about the condition of the home, they are much more willing to engage with the rest of it. But when they feel uncertain, they begin to factor in risk, and that risk shows up into more cautious offers, longer decision timelines, or sometimes no offers at all. So before you think about what to upgrade, it's critical to understand what needs to be stabilized or clarified first. And the fifth thing you need to understand is that a partial renovation can create more confusion than clarity. And this is one of the most common patterns that we actually see, where a seller updates one or two areas of the home, maybe the kitchen or the bathroom, but leaves the rest of the home in a different condition or style. And what that creates is inconsistency, and inconsistency makes it harder for buyers to interpret the home, because now you're trying to understand what's been updated, what hasn't, what would it take to finish the work, whether the overall home aligns with their expectations. And that mental work creates friction, and friction slows down that process. And in a market like Alamo Heights, where buyers are comparing multiple homes, anything that makes a home harder to interpret can cause them to move on. And this is why clarity matters more than perfection, because a home that's consistently presented, even if it's not fully updated, often performs better than a home that feels partially renovated but unfinished in its overall direction. And so when you're evaluating whether to renovate, it's not just about what to update, it's about whether the level of improvement creates a clear and cohesive presentation, or whether it introduces more questions than answers. And that leads directly into the sixth thing you need to understand, which is what the right level of renovation is, tied directly to your pricing strategy. It's not just your personal preference, because renovation decisions and pricing decisions cannot be separated. They have to work together, and this is where a lot of sellers unintentionally create misalignment. They invest in updates without fully understanding how the house will be positioned in the market. And when they price a home based on what they've spent, rather than how buyers are likely to respond, that is a problem. And in Alamo Heights, buyers are highly aware of value and comparison. And a misalignment becomes clear very quickly, because buyers are not really evaluating your investment. They are evaluating the home and how it compares to other options at that price point. So if the level of renovation does not match the level of pricing, the home can feel out of sync with buyer expectations. And that's where hesitation begins. So the key is to approach renovation and pricing as a single strategy, not two separate decisions, because the goal is not just to improve the home, it's to position the home in a way that feels logical, competitive, and easy for buyers to say yes to. I want to pause for a second and introduce myself. I am Caroline Decherd with the Park Properties Group at the Phyllis Browning Company. One of the most important parts of what we do here at the Park Properties Group is helping sellers evaluate whether renovation really makes sense at all. And if it does, what level of improvement actually creates a return versus just simply adding cost. So strategic improvements that we like to help pick things that increase clarity and confidence. And it's really not about how much you spend, but in how effectively your decisions align with how buyers are thinking and how the home will ultimately be positioned in the market. Once you understand how condition and pricing align, and how they create value, then now we can talk about the seventh and final thing you need to understand before deciding whether to renovate your home in Alamo Heights. And that is, most renovation decisions are not about what the home needs. They're about what the market expects at a specific price point. And this is where everything comes together, because sellers often approach renovation from a personal perspective, thinking about what they would want if they were staying in the home, or what it feels like an improvement based on their own preferences. But buyers are not evaluating their home through that lens. They're actually evaluating it based on comparison. They're asking, how does this home stack up against other homes at this price range? What feels finished, what feels incomplete, and what would we need to change if we bought it? And those questions happen quickly, often within minutes of walking through a property. And what determines the answers is not how much money has been spent. It's how clearly the home aligns with expectations for that price range. And that's why renovation decisions and pricing strategies have to be made together and not separate. Because if you renovate beyond what your market expects at your target price, you don't necessarily gain leverage. You simply increase your cost. And if you underprepare relative to that same price point, buyers begin to discount the home to account for all the work they believe is needed. And that gap between expectation and perception is where homes either gain momentum or lose it. And this is where a lot of sellers unintentionally create friction, not because they made the wrong improvements, but because the improvements were not aligned with how the home would ultimately be positioned. And to make this more concrete, think about it this way. If a home is going to be positioned in a range where buyers expect updated kitchens and bathrooms, leaving those spaces untouched may create hesitation. But fully renovating them at a level that exceeds what buyers expect at that price point may not create additional return. It simply narrows your profit margin. And the goal is not to impress buyers with your upgrades, it's to remove reasons for hesitation. And there are two very different approaches. Those are actually two very different approaches. And when you understand that, renovation decisions become much more strategic. Because instead of asking, what should I upgrade? You start asking, what would cause a buyer to pause? And that question leads to a much clearer decision. Because sometimes the answer is cosmetic, sometimes it's functional, and sometimes it's really nothing at all. And the last part is important because one of the most valuable things you can understand as a seller is that not every home needs a renovation to perform well. And in some cases, doing less actually creates a better outcome because it allows the home to be positioned clearly for a buyer who is comfortable making changes over time. And this is especially true in Alamo Heights, where there's a wide range of buyer preferences. Some buyers are specifically looking for move-in ready homes, while others are intentionally looking for properties they can update. And when a home is presented clearly within one of these categories, it tends to perform better than a home that tries to appeal to both ends, but ends up feeling like just uncertain. And this is where clarity becomes more important than completeness, because buyers don't need everything to be finished. They need to understand what they're looking at. And with that understanding, they can really have more clarity in making decisions. And when they hesitate, of course, it slows the momentum. And that's really the underlying theme across everything we've talked about, because whether it's pricing, preparation, presentation, or renovation, the goal is always the same. Reduce the friction, increase the clarity, make it easier for a buyer to say yes. And when you step back and look at all of these 7 points together, you start to see how they connect. First, not all renovations create equal returns. Second, buyers are not all looking for the same level of finish. Third, over-renovating can reduce your margin. Fourth, condition matters more than cosmetic upgrades. Fifth, partial renovations can create confusion. Sixth, renovation and pricing must be aligned. And now seventh, renovation decisions should be driven by market expectations, not personal preference. And when those 7 things are understood and applied correctly, the entire approach to selling changes. Because instead of trying to maximize every possible upgrade, you're making targeted decisions that support how the home will actually be perceived. And that's what ultimately drives stronger outcomes. Not how much was done, but how effectively it was done. And this is also where I want to shift into what this means for you practically. Because if you're thinking about selling, the goal is not to walk away from this conversation feeling like you need to start renovating immediately. The goal is to understand how to evaluate whether a renovation makes sense at all. And if it does, what level of improvements are actually worth pursuing, and where starting early becomes increasingly valuable. Because when you give yourself 3 to 6 month window before you go to market, you create the space to make these decisions thoughtfully instead of reactively. You can evaluate the home objectively. You can look at it through a buyer's lens. You can understand how it compares to other options in the market. And you can decide what changes, if any, will actually improve how it's perceived. And that process is very different from making decisions under pressure. Because when time is limited, the tendency is to overcorrect, to do more than necessary, or to focus on the wrong things simply because they feel visible. And that's where sellers often, unfortunately, spend money without creating meaningful return. But when you start earlier, you have the ability to step back, to prioritize, to build a strategy. And this is exactly where we start with our clients. Not with a list of renovations, but with a conversation about positioning, understanding where the home fits in today's market, what buyers are likely to expect at that level, and what changes would actually make a difference in how the home is received. And sometimes that leads to targeted updates, And sometimes it leads to simplifying what's already there, and sometimes it leads to the decision not to renovate at all. And all three of these outcomes can be correct depending on the situation. And that's why this is really not a one-size-fits-all decision. It's a strategy decision. If you'd like help thinking that through or understanding how your home would be positioned and whether renovation actually creates return in your specific situation, reach out to me. I'm Caroline Decherd, the Park Properties Group, the Phyllis Brown and Company. Love to walk through your home, hear about your goals, your timeline, and start that initial conversation to give you a plan for listing your house.